Lord, do not hold this sin against them." Stephen cried out to the Lord as the rocks battered his body. Stephen was a Christian. He was a servant. And although he was not a teacher, he could proclaim the gospel with as much passion as any of the apostles. Stephen was a Christian, stoned to death because he proclaimed the truth about Jesus. The church's first martyr. From the moment the early church began, opposition grew alongside it. The chief priests and leaders of the Jews had thought they had snuffed out the threat of Jesus, this teacher from Galilee, when they handed him over to be crucified. But then his disciples started proclaiming that Jesus, whom they had all seen die, was alive, that he had been with them, this band of uneducated people, that they had touched the wounds in his hands and feet, that attempting to gain righteousness on their own was futile, but only his righteousness could reconcile sinners to their Creator. The priests had even arrested Peter and John, two of the leaders of the Christians, and demanded they stop talking about this Jesus. And they had the gall to say that listening to them would be disobeying God. They wouldn't stop talking about Jesus. They kept telling people that salvation could only be found by faith in Jesus Christ, who died and rose again. And their numbers only increased with each passing day, until Stephen. Stephen proclaimed the gospel with signs and wonders from the Spirit in the freedmen's synagogue, but some of its members opposed him. They even persuaded others to accuse Stephen of speaking blasphemous words against Moses and God. "This man never stops speaking against this holy place and the law." The rest of the synagogue wanted to know if this was true. Could this man with the face of an angel be a demon in disguise? Could he truly be a blasphemer? Stephen's answer was to preach the gospel to them. And he began by recalling Israel's sins against their God, the saga of rebellion that began even while the patriarchs lived in the land of Canaan. That out of jealousy, they sold their brother Joseph into slavery, but God used their evil for their good. That although God sent Moses to rescue them from slavery in Egypt, they continually turned away from him and his teaching, seeking to return to their chains. That with every act of rebellion, God sent judges, kings, and prophets to lead Israel back to the way of righteousness. And every time, they would reject their Lord. They were stiff-necked people who rejected the Holy Spirit at every turn. And now they were rejecting God's righteous one, just as their ancestors had persecuted the prophets. "You received the law under the direction of angels, and yet have not kept it." Enraged, the crowd dragged Stephen outside the city and began throwing stones at him, murdering the man who showed them the way of salvation. And as news of Stephen's death spread, many of the Christians fled from Jerusalem. In persecuting the church, the religious leaders thought they were protecting God's law, but they only accomplished God's purposes. The Christians were scattered, and the gospel went with them wherever they went. In every community, these believers began to proclaim the good news of Jesus' death and resurrection. As persecution followed, they continued to proclaim the gospel through censure, mockery, beatings, imprisonment, banishment, and even death. The Christians kept proclaiming the good news of Christ's life, death, and resurrection. And more continued to be added to their numbers in every major city, in every country, across seas and oceans. As empires fell and rose and fell again, God's people continued to proclaim the gospel. And as persecution rose and decreased and rose again, God's people continued to proclaim the gospel. And they will continue to proclaim the gospel, despite resistance and persecution, until the day when Christ comes again, when the one who was persecuted for us comes to end the persecution of his people, and we are welcomed into his kingdom forevermore.